Next, we're going to take a look at our per unit costs of production. These are different from the aggregate costs that we just looked at. Aggregate are the costs added together. Per unit, no surprise, are looking at the costs on a unit by unit basis. So we're going to still take the concepts of fixed, variable, and total costs, but instead of looking at them in total, we're going to be looking at the typical costs. We're going to be looking at the average fixed cost, the average variable cost, and the average total cost. Average fixed cost is arrived at by simply dividing our fixed cost by the number of goods produced. So you recall from our last slide, our fixed costs were always $100. So our fixed costs were always equal to $100. So in this situation, we've got when 10 goods are produced, since our fixed costs are $100 divided by 10 goods equals an average fixed cost of 10. $100 divided by 25 goods produced is an average fixed cost of 4. So that you can note, as more and more goods are produced, the average fixed cost will decrease. The average fixed cost is a constantly decreasing function that will never equal 0 because it's some positive number being divided by some other positive number. So it will never actually reach 0. Our average variable costs are similarly arrived at. We're going to take our variable costs of production and divide them by the number of goods that are produced. You'll recall that when 0 lawns were mowed, our variable costs were also equal to 0. So to arrive at our average variable cost, it would be 0 divided by 0, which is simply undefined. So we're going to leave that as undefined. However, when 10 lawns were mowed with our first worker, the variable costs were $150. So if we take 150 and divide that by the 10 workers we have, you'll notice that the average variable cost is 15. Similarly, when we had 2 workers working, the variable costs were $325. If you divide 325 by 25, I'm giving you time to use your calculator if you want, you're going to arrive at $13 as your average variable cost. So the average variable cost is simply taking the variable cost and dividing it by the number of goods that are produced. So if your variable costs were 710, divided by 42 is equal to 1690. So you can construct your variable cost by taking your average variable cost, multiplying it by the number of mowed lawns, and that would actually equal your variable costs. Lastly, your average total cost is arrived at by, not surprisingly, dividing your total costs by the number of goods that are produced. So when we employed 1 worker, our total costs were $250. 250 divided by 10 is going to be equal to 25. So our average total cost when 1 worker is employed is $25 per good. Similarly, we could find out that when we employed 5 workers, our average total cost was $19.29 per lawn. So if we take $19.29 and multiply it by the 42 lawns that were mowed by 5 workers, we arrive at a total cost of $810. And if you check the slide previous, you'll notice that when we had 5 workers, our total costs were $810. The last concept we want to take a look at is marginal cost. Marginal cost is by far the most important of the costs that we'll be talking about. And it's worth taking a look at the formula to arrive at it. We're simply going to take the change in total cost and divide that by the change in output to arrive at our marginal cost. And what marginal cost is therefore telling us is the cost of 1 more good. Not from 1 more worker, but simply from 1 more good. It'll be helpful then to remember what our total costs of production were associated with the number of mowed lawns. So we'll just add that column over here, 100, 250, $425, $575, $700, and $810. And those numbers were simply the numbers that we had arrived at previously on our slides, but it'll be helpful to have them to reference here. So when we want to take a look at the marginal cost of production of the 10th good, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the change in total cost and divide it by the change in output. Because total costs went from $100 to $250, that is a change of $150. So we would put that 150 and divide it by the change in output at this time, which went from 0 to 10 mowed lawns. So 150 divided by 10 is therefore going to be equal to the $15 that we see here. It's worth doing that again, so let's calculate another example of this. So let's go ahead and get rid of our calculation from before so that we can do a new calculation. So now we're trying to find the marginal cost of the 25th good. Simply put, what we're going to do is we're going to still use our same formula. We need to find the change in total cost and divide it by the change in output. Well, in this situation, our total costs have now gone from $250 to $425. That represents a change of $175 divided by the change in output. So the difference between 10 and 25 is 15. So if we take that $175 and divide it by 15, you're going to note that we're going to arrive at a marginal cost of $11.67. This is a very important calculation, and I encourage you to do the remainder on your own. So one last time, to arrive at a marginal cost of 15, we're going to take a look at the change in total cost, that is between 425 and 575, and divide that by the change in output, which is going to be the difference between 25 and 35. So if you can calculate those numbers, you're going to arrive at a marginal cost of 15. Double check the work for the remaining two options as well. Lastly, we'd like to take a look at those per unit costs in a graphical format. This set of three graphs that you see here is perhaps the most important set of graphs that you're going to have in the entire course. This will be applicable to all of our different market structures, our different firms. This will remain constant, so it is imperative that you understand the interrelationship between the marginal cost, the average total cost, and the average variable cost. Of these three, the most important, as we said last time, is the marginal cost. And if you can take a look here, the marginal cost curve has a somewhat distinct shape. It kind of looks like a Nike swoosh. It decreases at first and then begins to increase at a more rapid basis. And the reason for that can be explained by diminishing marginal returns. When you add that worker to a fixed amount of capital, you add that next worker, it gets harder and harder for them to produce more goods, so therefore it becomes more and more costly to produce the next good. That is an incredibly important concept and one that I hope that you can understand and commit to memory. It's also important to note that this marginal cost curve is going to give shape to the two average cost curves. Whenever the marginal is below the average must decrease, and whenever the marginal is above the average must increase. So we can see here that when the marginal cost curve is below the average variable cost curve, the average variable cost curve is decreasing. That continues until it intersects with the marginal cost curve, and at that point the marginal cost curve now becomes above the average variable cost for the remainder of the graph, and we can see that the slope of the average variable cost curve begins to increase. Similarly, when the marginal cost curve is below the average total cost curve, the average total cost is decreasing until it intersects with the marginal cost and then rises thereafter. It's very, very important that we're able to graph these things accurately. This is one of the things that people will look closely at on your AP exam. So we're going to start off when we graph these three things. You'll never have the opportunity really to use the numbers, but rather a sketch of the graph. So we're going to start with our marginal cost curve and remind us that that looks like a Nike swoosh. Typically, the average variable cost curve starts at the same point as the marginal cost curve, decreases until it intersects with marginal cost, and then increases thereafter. We're going to label that the average variable cost. Lastly, the average total cost starts at a higher point, is decreasing because the marginal cost is below it, intersects the marginal cost curve, and then begins to increase thereafter. It is absolutely critical that we have the minimum of the average total cost curve on the marginal cost curve and the minimum of the average variable cost curve on the marginal cost curve. Failure to do so will result in an incorrect answer and an incorrect analysis. You'll notice that the one graph that we had that is missing from our per unit costs is the average fixed cost. And even though it's not typically graphed, it's available in our graph as well. You'll recall that if total cost is arrived at by adding fixed cost plus variable cost to equal total cost, fixed cost plus variable cost equals total cost, that we can similarly assume that average fixed cost plus average variable cost is going to equal average total cost. And so since we've got our average total cost and our average variable cost, the average fixed cost is somehow implied. So if we were to take a line and draw it up to the average variable cost curve, the length of that line is equal to the average variable cost at this number of goods. If we wanted to stay with that number of goods and draw another line, if we draw this red line, the length of that red line is the average total cost of X goods. So if the average fixed cost is plus the average variable cost equals the average total cost, if we simply subtract out the average variable cost from both sides of this equation, we'll get that average fixed cost is equal to average total cost minus average variable cost, meaning that the length of this line segment right here between the average total cost and the average variable cost curve is equal to the average fixed cost. And you'll notice that that is true throughout. That if we take a look at the length of this line at good Y, you'll notice it's notably smaller than the average fixed cost at good X. But that's to be expected because our average fixed cost is a diminishing function. So it's important when you draw these curves that not only do you have the average variable cost intersecting the marginal cost at its minimum, the average total cost intersecting the marginal cost at the average total cost minimum, but that also the average total cost must be getting closer to the average variable cost without ever touching, so that the average fixed cost at all points is getting smaller and smaller and smaller as more goods are produced. Thanks for taking the time to listen and walk through this whole process. I hope that you understand this to a much greater degree, and I invite you to do some practice. You'll find a practice file on my e-board, and using the concepts here, you should be able to complete the cost analysis sheet with only the given information. Good luck, give it your best shot, and if you have any questions, see me in class soon. Thanks, and take care.